She was 19 years old, and by the time the church elders finished speaking that Sunday morning, she had no household left to call her own. Her name was Delilah Marsh, and the man who cast her out was not kin at all but her late father's business partner, a man named Horace Grimsby, who had used a forged co-signature to claim her father's small freight company upon his sudden death, and who found it convenient, once the company was his, to inform Delilah that the modest room above the office had never really been his to keep. She left that morning with $4 her father had once given her for emergencies, sewn into a petticoat hem, and with those $4, in a town called Windmere Junction, she bought the one piece of land no one else in the county would touch at any price, $2 for the deed to the old Hollis family burying ground, a half-acre of tangled weeds and toppled headstones that the town had quietly abandoned and openly called cursed for 11 years, ever since its last caretaker vanished without a word. Every soul who heard of the purchase called it the final proof that grief had addled the girl's good sense. What none of them knew, what Delilah herself did not yet know as she pushed open the rusted iron gate, was that beneath those crooked headstones lay a secret sealed away by a dying man's careful hand, a secret that would not only restore her own fortune but would return to an entire community something it had believed lost forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delilah Marsh. If tonight finds you in a season that feels forgotten or overlooked, we would love to hear where you're watching from in the comments below. Delilah Marsh was born in the autumn of 1867 in Windmere Junction, a modest freight and farming town built where two dusty roads cross in the rolling hill country, the only daughter of a freight hauler named Thaddeus Marsh, a careful, methodical man who built his small hauling company one wagon at a time through years of honest dealing, and a mother, Corinne, who died bringing Delilah into the world, leaving father and daughter to raise each other in a modest house behind the freight office. Thaddeus never remarried, pouring instead into his daughter both his grief and his devotion, and Delilah grew up not among dolls and needlework but among ledgers and manifests, sitting on a high stool in her father's office from the time she could hold a pencil steady, learning to read a bill of lading before she learned to read a storybook, because Thaddeus believed, in his quiet and unusual way for that era, that a daughter with no brothers to inherit his trade or to understand it every bit as well as any son would have. What Thaddeus Marsh valued above all else in his business, and what he impressed upon Delilah with the patient repetition of a man who had seen too many honest people cheated by those who kept careless or dishonest records, was the sanctity of a proper accounting. He kept his own ledgers in triplicate, one copy at the office, one copy at the bank, and one copy, a habit that struck Delilah as eccentric until much later, filed with the county recorder as a matter of public notice, because Thaddeus had watched, early in his career, a rival hauler falsify a partnership agreement and swindle an elderly widow out of her late husband's share of a freight line. And Thaddeus had vowed from that day that no one would ever be able to say the same of him, that his word and his written record would always match exactly, witness and file where dishonest hands could not quietly alter them. Delilah's father also taught her, in the long hours they spent together tending the horses and greasing the wagon axles, a quieter lesson about the dignity of things the world considered finished or worthless. He had a habit, whenever their route passed the old Hollis family burying ground at the edge of town, of removing his hat, not out of morbid reverence but out of what he called simple courtesy, explaining to young Delilah that the people resting there had built the very roads their wagons rolled on, had cleared the very field that fed the town, and deserved, in his words, to be remembered as more than an inconvenience to be driven past. The graveyard had belonged, in its founding decade before, to the Hollis family, early settlers of Windmere Junction, and had gradually become the resting place for much of the original township before a newer, larger cemetery was established closer to the church, leaving the old ground to fall slowly out of use and, eventually, out of care. When Delilah was 14, her father took on a business partner, a smooth-talking man named Horace Grimsby, who arrived in Windmere Junction claiming experience in the freight trade from back east and offering capital that Thaddeus, hoping to expand his small company into the growing regional trade, badly needed. Delilah remembered disliking Horace Grimsby from their very first meeting, though she could not, at 14, have said precisely why, only that his handshake was too eager and his praise of her father too frequent and too florid, the kind of flattery that seemed designed less to express genuine admiration than to secure trust more quickly than trust ought reasonably to be secured. Thaddeus, older and more trusting than his daughter, saw only a capable partner and welcomed Grimsby's investment, and the company grew steadily over the following 5 years under their joint management, though Delilah noticed, in the quiet way a watchful daughter notices things, that her father grew increasingly careful in his private ledgers whenever Grimsby's transactions were involved, cross-checking figures twice where once he had checked them only once. Thaddeus Marsh died suddenly in the winter of 1886, when Delilah was 19, fell by a heart seizure while inspecting a wagon axle on an unusually cold morning, and it was in the chaos and grief of the weeks that followed that Horace Grimsby produced, before the county probate office, a partnership agreement bearing what appeared to be Thaddeus's own signature, granting Grimsby full controlling interest in the Marsh Freight Company in the event of either partner's death, a document Delilah had never once seen or heard her father mention in 5 years of watching him guard his affairs so carefully. She protested that the signature looked wrong to her, that her father would never have agreed to terms that so thoroughly disinherited his only child. But she was 19, unmarried, and possessed of no legal standing beyond her word against the signed document, and the county probate judge, a tired man eager to settle the matter and unwilling to entertain what looked to him like a grieving daughter's understandable but legally insufficient suspicion, upheld the agreement. What Delilah carried out of those 19 years, beyond grief for a father she had loved deeply, was his own scrupulous instinct for records that did not match, his conviction that the forgotten deserved remembering rather than dismissal, and a stubborn, quiet certainty that something in Horace Grimsby's smooth confidence had never once rung true. 3 inheritances that felt, on the morning she was finally told to vacate the room above the office, like nothing at all against the vast and settled power of a signed legal document, and that would prove, within the year, to be exactly what she needed. The fall came with a particular cruelty of grief compounded by betrayal. In the weeks after the probate ruling, Horace Grimsby proved himself, freed of Thaddeus's watchful partnership, considerably less scrupulous than the man Delilah's father had trusted, cutting corners on wagon maintenance, overcharging established customers, and treating the company's longtime drivers with an impatience that drove 2 of Windmere Junction's most experienced haulers to quit within a month. Delilah, still living above the office out of Grimsby's grudging, temporary charity, watched her father's careful legacy being dismantled piece by piece and said as much, more than once, until Grimsby, tired of what he called her interference in matters no longer her concern, informed her that the room had never legally belonged to her, that he had been generous enough already, and that she had until Sunday to find other lodging. She left that Sunday morning with $4 sewn into a petticoat hem, money her father had given her 2 years before specifically for emergencies, telling her then, in words she now turned over and over in her mind, that a woman ought always to keep something set aside that no one else knew about, because circumstances could change faster than anyone expected. Delilah walked through Windmere Junction that morning with nowhere fixed to go, past the church where the congregation was just filing out from services, past the mercantile, past the newer cemetery where her father now lay, and it was there, standing at her father's fresh grave in the tidy, well-tended new burying ground, that she found herself thinking of the old Hollis ground at the town's edge, the forgotten place her father had always tipped his hat to, and wondering, with the particular, desperate clarity of a person with nothing left to lose, whether anyone had ever actually settled its ownership since old Silas Hollis, the last caretaker, had vanished 11 years before under circumstances the town still spoke of only in low, uneasy voices. She walked to the county land office that same afternoon and learned, from a clerk more amused and helpful, that the old Hollis burying ground had indeed reverted to the county for unpaid taxes years before and had sat unclaimed ever since, because no one in 3 counties wanted to own a half-acre of cursed, overgrown graves at the edge of a town that avoided walking past it after dark. The curse, the clerk explained with the relish of a man enjoying a good story, dated to Silas Hollis's disappearance itself, the old caretaker having vanished one autumn night without a trace, his lantern found still burning beside an open, freshly dug grave that held, when townsfolk finally worked up the courage to look, nothing at all, an empty hole dug for no coffin anyone could account for, and the town had simply decided, in the absence of any better explanation, that something unnatural had claimed him. Delilah, with her father's $4 and her father's own quiet insistence that the forgotten deserved remembering, offered the clerk $2 on the spot for the deed, and the clerk, delighted to be rid of a worthless parcel and mildly astonished that anyone would want it, processed a transfer before the hour was out. $2 for the Hollis family burying ground, and Delilah Marsh, evicted from the only home she had left not 3 hours before, found herself the owner of half an acre that every soul in Windmere Junction agreed was not merely worthless but actively unlucky, a fact that did nothing to dim the strange, stubborn resolve settling into her chest as she walked out to see her new property for the first time that same evening. The graveyard, when she reached it in the fading autumn light, looked exactly as forgotten as its reputation suggested, headstones leaning at odd angles beneath a tangle of blackberry bramble and volunteer sumac. The old caretaker's cottage at the property's edge collapsed almost entirely into its own foundation, and a general air of neglect so thorough that Delilah understood, walking its overgrown paths, precisely why no one had wanted it. She slept that first night in the one corner of the collapsed cottage that still held a sound roof, wrapped in her coat, and in the gray light of the next morning began, because grief and desperation both needed somewhere to go, the slow work of clearing the worst of the growth from around the oldest headstones, reading the names as she worked, Hollis and Prather and Weeks and Beaumont, the town's earliest families, resting quietly beneath weeds that had been allowed to swallow their remembrance. It was on the third day of this slow clearing, working near the collapsed cottage foundation, that Delilah found what would change everything. Beneath a fallen section of the cottage's hearthstone, dislodged when she pried at a stubborn root, she discovered a narrow iron box, rusted but intact, wedged into a cavity someone had clearly built beneath the hearth with deliberate care, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the contents remarkably dry across more than a decade, she found a thick bundle of papers in a careful, cramped hand she did not recognize, along with a small leather pouch of coin, and, folded separately at the very bottom, a rough hand-drawn map of the graveyard itself, with several headstones marked in a way that made no immediate sense to her. The papers, when Delilah's trembling hands finally worked through them by the light of a small fire that evening, told her, over the course of that long and sleepless night, precisely what had become of old Silas Hollis, and precisely why the town had never found an answer. Silas, she learned from his own careful writing, had been more than a simple caretaker. He had been, for the final years of his tenure, a quiet keeper of trust for the town's earliest families, much as blacksmiths and shopkeepers in other towns sometimes served that role, except that Silas's particular arrangement had grown from an unusual and specific need. In the years following the Civil War, Windmere Junction, like many small towns, had struggled with the collapse of its local currency and the slow, uneven return of paper money's value, and several of the town's founding families, distrustful of banks that had failed elsewhere in the region during those uncertain years, had asked Silas, a man everyone trusted by virtue of his solitary, unremarkable position tending their ancestors' graves, to hold small sums of gold and silver coin in trust, to be released to their heirs only upon presentation of a specific token or password Silas kept recorded, along with the amount and the family it belonged to, in his own private accounting. Silas's papers explained further, in a hand that grew visibly more agitated across the later pages, that he had grown afraid in his final months of a man who had recently arrived in Windmere Junction claiming to be a distant Hollis relative entitled to inherit both the graveyard and, Silas suspected, whatever else of value the old caretaker might be holding, a man whose name, when Delilah read it, made her breath catch in her throat. An early alias of Horace Grimsby, who had apparently arrived in the region under a different surname some years before establishing himself, under his current name, as her father's trusted business partner. Silas wrote that this man had pressed him repeatedly for information about rumored buried valuables on the property, had grown threatening when Silas denied any knowledge, and that Silas, fearing for his safety and unwilling to betray the trust the town's families had placed in him, had made the decision to fake his own disappearance, digging an empty grave to suggest some unnatural fate, and simply leaving Windmere Junction under cover of night rather than risk either his life or his neighbors' hidden savings, intending, his final entry explained, to return quietly once the danger had passed and restore what he held to its rightful owners. Silas Hollis, it seemed from the abrupt end of his written account, had never returned, whether from fear, misfortune, or simple inability to find his way safely back to a town that now believed him claimed by something supernatural, Delilah could not say. But his final page, dated the very night of his disappearance, contained a hurried postscript explaining that he had chosen, in his last hours before fleeing, not to carry the trust fund with him where it might be lost or stolen on the road, but to bury it properly within the graveyard itself, marked according to the map she now held, trusting that the ground he had tended so faithfully would keep it safer than his own uncertain journey ever could. Delilah sat with those pages until dawn, understanding with mounting dread and wonder both what she now possessed, a map to a trust fund belonging to the town's founding families. Hidden for 11 years beneath ground, everyone had avoided out of superstitious fear, and confirmation, in Silas's own careful hand, that a man who had stolen her father's company through a forged document had, under a different name, once threatened an old caretaker into a decade of hiding. The realization settled over her slowly, the way cold settles into a room after the fire dies. Horace Grimsby's interest in her father's freight company, she now suspected, had never been solely about freight at all. A man who moved goods across the county on a regular, unremarkable schedule, whose wagons no one thought twice to search, would have made an ideal cover for a man still quietly hunting the fortune he believed remained hidden somewhere in or near the old graveyard he had once tried and failed to claim. She spent the following days working carefully, using Silas's map to locate, without disturbing any actual grave, 3 specific marked headstones where small iron caches had buried at shallow, deliberate depth beneath the stones themselves rather than within any burial plot, containing among them some $600 in gold and silver coin, a modest fortune for that place and time, along with Silas's own careful accounting ledger naming exactly which families and which sums of trust represented. Families whose names Delilah recognized immediately from her father's own old customer records, the Hollises, the Prathers, the Weekses, many of whom still lived in or near Windmere Junction and who had, she now understood, spent 11 years believing whatever small savings they had entrusted to old Silas had simply vanished along with him. What Delilah needed, she realized, turning the problem over with the same careful attention her father had once applied to a ledger that failed to balance, was not merely to quietly return the fund to its rightful families, which alone would restore a great deal of trust and goodwill toward her, but to expose, publicly and undeniably, the connection between Horace Grimsby and the man who had threatened Silas Hollis into hiding, since that connection, if she could prove it, might finally give her legal standing to challenge the forged partnership agreement that had stolen her father's company. She began, cautiously, to make inquiries, first at the county land office where she confirmed that Grimsby's original arrival in the region, some years before he appeared in Windmere Junction under his current name, matched almost exactly the timeline Silas's papers described for the threatening stranger, and then, more carefully still, with an elderly former resident named Agatha Weeks, whose family had lost a modest sum to Silas's disappearance, who remembered when Delilah gently asked, "A stranger matching Grimsby's description, asking pointed questions about the Hollis graveyard's history in the very same season Silas vanished." The conflict, when it came, arrived swiftly once word reached Horace Grimsby, as inevitably did in a town as small as Windmere Junction, that the Marsh girl was digging about a strange new property and asking peculiar questions about old Silas Hollis. Grimsby, who had spent 5 years building a respectable reputation as Thaddeus Marsh's trusted partner and now as sole proprietor of the town's principal freight company, could not afford the resurrection of a decade-old scandal that might connect him to a vanished caretaker and a threatened town savings, and he rode out to the old graveyard himself within days, ostensibly to express polite concern for a young woman living alone among such unsettling surroundings, and to offer, with what he clearly believed was generous condescension, to purchase the worthless property from her for considerably more than she had paid, an offer Delilah recognized instantly as a man attempting to bury a threat before it could fully surface. She declined, calmly, and watched something harden behind Grimsby's practiced smile before he rode back toward town. The pressure that followed was as predictable as it was uncomfortable. The mercantile, whose owner did considerable business with Grimsby's freight company, grew suddenly unwilling to extend Delilah credit for supplies. A local carpenter who had agreed to help her repair the caretaker's cottage found the arrangement mysteriously cancelled. Whispers moved through Windmere Junction, never traceable directly to Grimsby, suggesting the Marsh girl's grief over her father and a strange new obsession with a cursed graveyard indicated a mind not entirely sound, a rumor calculated to undermine any claim she might later bring before the county. Delilah understood she could not simply confront Grimsby directly, not when he controlled the town's principal freight company and had, over 5 years, cultivated relationships with nearly every merchant and official who might otherwise have taken her seriously, and so she resolved instead to do what her father had always taught her, assemble a record so careful and so thoroughly corroborated that no dishonest hand could quietly explain it away. She spent the following weeks visiting, one by one, The families named in Silas Hollis's ledger, showing each in turn their own entry, watching disbelief give way first to grief for years of savings believed lost, and then to a hardening resolve once she explained, carefully and without accusation she could not yet prove, that the fund had been recovered intact, and that the man who had likely frightened Silas into hiding might well be living among them still under a different name. She also wrote, with painstaking care, a full account of everything she had found, corroborated by Agatha Weeks's memory and by land office records establishing Grimsby's earlier presence in the region, and carried this account personally to a county judge in the seat 2 days' ride distant, a deliberate, careful man named Judge Elias Colwyn, requesting a formal hearing to both settle the disposition of the recovered trust fund and to reopen, in light of new evidence, the probate matter of her father's estate, Grimsby. Sensing the ground shifting beneath him as families he had assumed permanently cowed by his standing began quietly comparing notes, attempted one final maneuver, appearing before the local justice of the peace, a man within his own social circle, to claim that Delilah's discovery of buried coin on what was legally her own property entitled her to nothing beyond what county law allowed a landowner to claim from an unmarked find, an attempt to strip the recovery of its context as a trust fund belonging to named families before Judge Colwyn's more distant and less compromised hearing could ever take place. It was Agatha Weeks's own grandson, a young clerk at the county recorder's office who had grown quietly troubled by what he'd observed of Grimsby's maneuvering, who warned Delilah that the local justice intended to rule within days, urging her to reach Judge Colwyn before that ruling could take hold. Delilah rode the 2 days to the county seat herself, arriving travel-worn with Silas's ledger, his map, and her own careful account in hand, to find that Judge Colwyn, informed in advance by a letter from young Weeks, had already moved his sitting forward specifically to hear her matter before any local ruling could complicate it. The hearing that followed unfolded with the same careful weight such reckonings always seemed to carry, witness after witness, Agatha Weeks describing the strangest questions the season Silas vanished, land office record confirming Grimsby's earlier presence under a different name, and Silas Hollis's own ledger, corroborated by the physical recovery of exactly the sums and locations it described, standing as evidence no reasonable judge could dismiss as coincidence. Judge Colwyn, examining alongside this the original probate file for Thaddeus Marsh's estate, noted what the original tired judge had apparently overlooked, that the ink in hand of the disputed partnership agreement signature bore inconsistencies with authenticated samples of Thaddeus's actual signature preserved in his triplicate filing with the county recorder, the very safeguard Thaddeus had built into his practice years before specifically to prevent this exact kind of fraud. Judge Colwyn voided the fraudulent partnership agreement, restoring the Marsh Freight Company to Delilah as her father's sole rightful heir, and referred the matter of Grimsby's conduct, both regarding the forged document and his earlier threats against Silas Hollis, for further criminal investigation, a process that would, over the following months, strip Grimsby of both the freight company and the respectable standing he had spent years cultivating in Windmay Junction. The $600 recovered from beneath the old graveyard's headstones, Delilah insisted from the moment it was formally accounted for, belonged entirely to the families whose names filled Silas's careful ledger, and she distributed it accordingly, keeping for herself only what the court determined was fairly owed her as a landowner who had recovered it, using that modest sum not for personal comfort, but to properly restore the old Hollis family burying ground itself, clearing its paths, righting its fallen stones, and rebuilding the caretaker's cottage as a small dwelling where she herself chose to live, tending the grounds her father had always tipped his hat to, now finally given the remembrance he had always believed the forgotten deserved. We began this story by telling you that a 19-year-old girl, cast out with nothing, spent her last $2 on a cursed graveyard nobody wanted, and that beneath its headstones lay something that would change her life beyond anything she could have imagined. Now you understand what she found there, not merely $600 in long-buried coin, though that alone would have transformed her circumstances, but the truth behind an old caretaker's mysterious disappearance, proof of the fraud that had stolen her father's legacy, and a debt of trust 11 years overdue finally returned to the families who had never stopped quietly grieving its loss. Delilah Marsh never forgot her father's habit of removing his hat before the old burying ground, his quiet insistence that the forgotten deserved to be remembered rather than driven past, and his careful triplicate ledgers, kept exactly so that no dishonest hand could quietly rewrite the truth. She had been told she was worth nothing, entitled to nothing, and she had answered that judgment not with anger but with the same patient, careful attention her father had given every account he ever kept, until the truth, properly recorded and properly witnessed, could no longer be denied. Thank you for spending this hour with Delilah Marsh and the people of Windmere Junction. If her story moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who needs reminding that a place or a person the world has written off as cursed or worthless may simply be waiting for someone patient enough to look closer. We would love to know, in the comments below, about a time you found real value in something everyone else had given up on, whether it was an old home, a forgotten skill, or a person the world too quickly dismissed. Your stories mean so much to this community, and we read every one of them. If tonight's journey to Windmere Junction stayed with you, we have many more stories like Delilah's waiting for you. Until next time, stay close.